So, hi everyone. I'm here today with Professor Thane Gustafson, who's a professor of international relations at Georgetown in Washington and has been following the Russia story very closely. Wrote a very nice piece the other day, which he kindly agreed to let us repost in BNE about the whole Avdovaz saga, the maker of the Lada, which is a great story, and that has completely collapsed. So, Thane, thank you for joining me. Great pleasure to have you here.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, Ben. And the only surprising thing is that our paths haven't crossed before.
Well, they have now. They have now.
As our lives have intertwined.
Yeah.
I go back almost as far as you do, maybe farther. My first exposure to the Soviet Union was actually in Soviet Kiev when I went there as an exchange student, a stagiaire, during one of our brief periods of thaw in the early 1970s.
Gosh.
It was a great place to be, but it was a Russian-speaking town in those days.
Yes. I started my career in Eastern Europe. The first place I was ever was Kiev in May '93. And I agree, it's a gorgeous place to live, although there was nothing there in those days. But why don't we dive in? I mean, the question of the day is, are sanctions working? And there's been a lot of debate about this. And then, of course, there was this famous report from Yale, which says the economy has collapsed. And we did a deep dive into that, and the picture's a lot more confused. And obviously, those who say it hasn't collapsed are pointing to this massive current account that Russia's actually making more money than it's ever made in its life. Nevertheless, the technological sanctions and equipment bans that have been put on are extremely damaging, permanently damaging. And so the other side of the debate is saying, well, look, yeah, the sanctions are working. It's just we're not seeing the effect of them at the moment. They'll take a little while to kick in. I just wondered if you had a view on where we stand, to what extent have they failed, or they're just delayed, or what do you think is going to happen?
Well, Ben, I've been trying to organize that question in my own mind. And as you've been writing as well, it is complicated. And it's also generating all kinds of over hasty generalizations. I think, first of all, one has to, first of all, in broad brushstrokes, the sanctions are clearly having an impact. They will continue to have an impact, perhaps even more as time goes on. And so to put this in perspective, what we have put in place in very hasty response to the Russian invasion is a system of sanctions, a network, you might even say a web of sanctions coming out of the United States, the EU, Canada, et cetera, that go far beyond anything that has ever been attempted before. So we're talking about a high stakes, high roller experiment on a scale that is totally unique against an economy larger and more developed and more powerful than any that has ever been subjected to sanctions before, let alone such sweeping ones.
So we're in uncharted territory here, are we? I mean, we're in uncharted territory here.
We are in totally uncharted territory. And that, combined with the continuing war, makes this a very sensitive and dangerous area of social science experimentation, if you like.
Do you think, though, the West has underestimated, because they brought out, the thing that shocked was not only the sanctions, but what they included, the seizing of the central bank's money, which was just not even on the radar before this happened. And also the SWIFT sanctions, which were seen as a nuclear option. And they came in on day 2 with SWIFT sanctions. So they've really hit hard. But at the same time, in retrospect, sitting where we are today, 6 months on, you can say that the West thought those were going to be crushing sanctions because they brought out the big guns on day 1, day 2. And yet it seems that the West has underestimated both Russia's resilience and the robust nature of the economy, which is actually now coming back to not normal, but certainly it's doing a lot better than it should be. Do you think they underestimated the Russian economy?
Yes, on the whole, yes. I think there's a persistent belief in the United States and in Europe, which you've encountered, I'm sure, for many years, a persistent belief that that Russia is an underdeveloped country, and that its level of industry, et cetera, is primitive. That turns out to be true in some areas, but not at all in others. And that's part of what makes the analysis a challenge. To organize the thing in your mind and in your listeners' minds, Ben, I would suggest this. You have to separate, first of all, by sector. The financial sanctions clearly have had one kind of impact. The sanctions that were applied against brand names in consumer goods and retail, such as McDonald's, that's another kind of impact. The sanctions that have hit the auto industry and the electricity sector, that's another kind of impact.
And
And then
devastating.
finally, the sanctions that have been aimed at individuals, and particularly the oligarchs, that's yet another kind of impact. So right there, differentiate by sector to begin with. Second, organized by time frame. The initial impact was actually quite devastating in the initial weeks, but the Russian central bank and the finance ministry responded very quickly, very creatively. It's a good team. We've known that for a long time. Elvira Nabiullina, the chair of the Russian central bank, is very good. So that was the initial phase. Then you go into the middle range where we are now, and we start talking about the secondary impact and also initial retaliation by the Russians. So that's all about oil and gas. By the way, for your listeners, yes, indeed, the Russians are making a pile of money on the high energy prices, but that's turning out to be a problem because they're sitting on so much hard currency that it's driving the ruble exchange rate way up, and they've not been able to rein it back in. So then finally, the third phase, which is, I think, what ultimately you and I are most interested in, starting a year or two out, what is the long-term impact of sanctions? Because the fact is, we're likely to be in the sanctions world indefinitely.
Yes, it's the same as the what are they called from the 70s with Soviet Jews? I've forgotten it now, but it took decades to get rid of those, and I don't see the sanctions coming off. I mean, then there's a longer term question here. To what extent do you think the world has been divided and that we're into a new Cold War? Because Putin quite clearly is looking to the global South. China obviously is the key, the anchor to that relationship, and China is on board within sort of pragmatic limits because it needs to keep its exports to the West going. But then they're looking, countries like Vietnam. We've written quite a lot about Russia in Africa. Lavrov was just there on a tour and was well met, and they're offering arms, grain, money, nuclear power technology, and they're being well received. And through to Latin America, it's another region which is, broadly supporting Russia. But it's not going to be a division like the old one, because that was based on ideology, communism versus capitalism. And this time round, we're all capitalists. And so all of those countries will want to keep relations with the West. So there's going to be some sort of more complicated fudge. So can we even call it a Cold War? I mean, how do you cut that up?
Well, of course, I'm a professor, so you've asked me a professor's question. And so I'll try not to natter on. But I just wonder, here's a challenge response for you in one word. How do you like that from a professor? In one word, that maybe the coming world is neither capitalism nor
communism.
What's the other word? But rather mercantilist is a word that we used to use back in the 19th century, where each country tries to defend its own turf, tries to export more than it imports. Of course, that's the great flaw in mercantilism. And basically, it's a beggar thy neighbor, each dog in front of its own kennel, and the devil
So
take the hindmost.
the Russians are definitely taking that line and mercantile relationships, and Lavrov specifically was, bearing gifts when he went. Grain for Africa is obviously a key one, but I discovered that there's a whole bunch of nuclear power stations that are going to go up. I mean, there's one in South Africa, but they're about to build or in the process of building one in Egypt, and I forget the others. I think it's Zimbabwe and Zambia. Zambia definitely have plans for a Russian nuke power station. Whereas if we look at our sides, they're talking about values and rules-based world and respect for international law, and it looks a lot more ideological. But I didn't get the impression, particularly in Africa, that that went down very well with the African nations, and they were looking at Russia and like, no, the Russians are going to bring money in business. So in that sense, it seems, to play devil's advocate, that the Kremlin strategy is the more appropriate one in terms of getting all these countries on board. Do you think that's the case, or are we about business too?
Well, I agree with that, particularly where Africa is concerned. Um, the outsiders, the Chinese in the first instance, and the Russians, and for that matter, the rest of us, are welcome so long as we're bringing money, so long as we reinforce the existing power structures.
Mm.
Let's face it, oil revenues, for example, from the Western multinationals, they don't actually benefit the local economies, they benefit the local elites. That money ends up in Switzerland. So the Chinese were very welcome, for example, with the Belt and Road Initiative in places like Zambia and Kenya, so long as they were bringing in money and manpower, thank you, so we can build some railroads. But the oversight, the supervision was so poor, and the price tag to the Chinese so high, that the Chinese are discovering that the Belt and Road Initiative is in fact not the great instrument that they imagined it would be. It doesn't buy you all that much influence. As soon as the project goes broke, your influence disappears. And I
Mm.
think the Russians are going to discover the same thing, except
Mm.
that the Russians don't have nearly as much money to spend on their equivalent of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Mm.
Take nuclear power as a case in point. Every one of those nukes has been financed by the Russian government.
Yeah. Yeah. To change tack slightly, there's an issue with the state supporting Ukraine, and although they've talked about and have provided a lot of weapons, and another package just recently, another billion, and the HIMARS missiles in particular have been spectacularly effective. Nevertheless, if you listen to Vancouver, to Zelensky, they're complaining that they're not getting enough weapons, and they're not getting the things they really want, which is tanks and planes. And it was pointed out to me that things like a HIMARS, it's highly accurate, so it's great at taking out command posts with generals in, or taking down bridges, or blowing up ammunition dumps, but it doesn't kill lots of soldiers. And that's the issue, is that you need something that can attack infantry, whereas the Russia has that in spades. Basically, it's artillery and the dumb missiles. And it means that the military aid the States is giving is going to prolong the war without being decisive, because they're holding back on these infantry threatening weapons. And it leaves the States, and I was just reading in I think it's Wall Street Journal, an op-ed saying that the strategy is actually that the States, on the one hand, is not committing itself and taking the bet on Ukrainian victory, but at the same time, it's ensuring that Ukraine is not defeated, and that you're left in this, and poor Ukraine is left in this limbo where they're just going to keep fighting, but without the resources to decisively win. So what's the thinking behind the States to do this? Is it just sort of caught on the horns of a dilemma? Or do they actually cynically want to prolong the war in order to drain Russia of as much resources, both militarily and economically, as it can?
Well, there, of course, you're deep into the military side of the conundrum, and I don't claim any particular expertise in
Mm.
that area. So um, I'm not sure that anything I might say would be terribly helpful. except to say this: we're seeing all parties dancing on the horns of the dilemma, each in its own way. So you get the impression sometimes that America is willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. You get the impression sometimes that the Ukrainians are willing to fight to the last American. The Europeans are sort of dancing in the middle, saying we're providing weapons, but not really. And then the Russians, well, where are the Russians at this point? They don't have that much manpower available. What they have is of low quality, and so on. Is this a formula for a frozen conflict or a semi-frozen conflict that goes on forever? Not necessarily, because there are some destabilizers, and HIMARS is one of them.
Mm. What do you think it would take to stop the fighting? I mean, do you think if Putin takes all of Donbass, he would draw the line there and cut his losses and declare victory and then just dig in?
Ben, I think another 3 centuries would do nicely.
Yes. And the economy, the Russian economy, we've said it is earning lots of cash. We assume that it's going to slow down as, well, I've been arguing as things get back to normal, when the prices come down, then you've actually denigrated the productivity in Russian economy quite significantly. And it was only growing by 2% before the war, and now it can't grow. I mean, Nabiullina said that, I think in March, that she advised the companies, you're going to have to go back 2 generations of technology, which is an astounding thing to say in order to function. I mean, do you think, how will that play out? I mean, will Russia become like a North Korea, or will it manage to bypass it through its friends?
If we assume that the sanctions regime remains in place, then I agree that the more pessimistic long-term predictions, no, not the more pessimistic, but pessimistic long-term projections, as opposed to the word collapse that some people are using. The Russian economy will not collapse, but it will be constantly under the drag of the sanctions and also of its own inherited vulnerabilities and its own policy choices.
Do you
Let
do you
me
think
take an
that
example to show what I mean.
uh,
Take the automotive sector, which is clearly hard hit. Yes, sure, the sanctions have been responsible for the withdrawal of Renault, but why is it that the Russians were in such a state of dependence? Because they opted 20 years ago for inviting Renault in to get a fast track solution to develop a modern mass car. So the sanctions then are superimposed on a situation of self-inflicted vulnerability.
mm. the I mean, to be fair to the Kremlin, they tried very hard. They wanted to buy Opel from the Germans and to basically import the technology. And actually, the Merkel specifically nixed that deal. Putin was extremely angry, and so they went for the next best thing. And they were really pushing the car producers to localize their production. But people like Renault, they just weren't interested because it's like, we want to keep this outside.
Sure.
And I think there was a strategic view by the car producers, backed by the government. It's like, we're not happy if you're going to transfer that technology to Russia, because we're going to end up with a giant rival at the end of the day, and no one really wanted to go there, and it's left vulnerable, as you say. But let me ask you specifically, because one of the arguments is when this pain kicks in, which we assume is coming, and the quality of life falls, which it will, to what extent do you think that the people will rebel against Putin? Do you think that there's a chance dissatisfaction growing to the point where you get popular dissent? Because at the moment, the polls show everyone's very happy with him and is supporting the war.
Well, I'll take out my best crystal ball and give it a rub. Sure, if you imagine the war dragging on and on and on, effectively a stalemate. And if you imagine the sanctions dragging on and on and on, and dragging the performance of the Russian economy downward, sure, you've got the elements in place that people respond to, an economy that is not performing well, living standards that are not increasing. Well, at a minimum, you can say this, that Putin has been extraordinarily lucky up until now. Imagine coming into power in 1999, just as oil prices are turning around. Then 15 years of a bonanza, culminating with record high oil prices. The man is unbelievably lucky. And Russians have supported him, particularly because of the economic performance, the best living standards Russians have had in their history for those 15 years, and then some carryover effect. Add to that the initial adrenaline that comes from beating up on a neighboring country. And initially, so there you are. Hurrah, hurrah, Russia is back. Well, that'll get you some more adrenaline for a while. But as those two supports, as those two positives start to wear down, what happens then? I don't pretend to know. My crystal ball suddenly stopped functioning.
No, there's a lot of people who are unhappy. And actually the same is true, I think, on the European side. I mean, here in Berlin, there's a growing sense of panic that this winter is going to be very unpleasant. The heating bills are already shooting up to extraordinary levels. And until now, it hasn't cost, the man in the street anything, but it will cost them. And then to what extent can the West has the same problem that, as this economic war starts to bite, it's going to undermine their political base and the support for the war on our side. So I think this autumn is going to be fraught for everybody. But then listen, we have to wrap up there because we're running out of time. I want to thank you again very much for taking the time to talk to me. And I highly recommend everyone look up your Substack list. It's got lots of great things in there. The car sector one was good. LNG, you're writing about turbines next, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
And that'll have to do with the decline in the electrical gas-fired sector. What are the Russians going to do with all that gas that they're not going to be exporting to Europe? Well, they'll have to swallow it in their gas-fired power plants, which will continue to work inefficiently, but they will continue to work. And so that sector will not collapse either.
Sounds like the history of Russia as I know it. They just sort of muddle through. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Take care.
Take care.